Well, good morning, good morning, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back. Just a little bit of a heads up. I seem to have a little bit of a scratchy throat this morning, so you're going to hear that occasionally throughout the recording. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to get this thing uploaded so that you can be watching this with everything that's going on this morning. So, today we're going to be doing chapter 7 and 8, Art as Spirituality, and then Angels and Muses. So, interesting before we even dive in is that as you're going through this book, I hope, if anything, like I was talking with Susan, that to get the broad view or perspective that Thomas More can bring into this discussion of a religion of one's own, and the depth that he can go into it, to me is magical. As he dives into some of these other topics that you may or may not have even considered. And I know for me personally, as being somebody who was not very into art, that changed significantly for me when I went to Florence, Italy, and I got to see David, and I got to see Michelangelo, and I got to see this amazing art. And then art came alive to me, even to the point now where Leah's grandfather is actually a well-known artist in the Grand Rapids area, Armand Marizan. And he's sold thousands of paintings and some for quite a bit of money. And so we've got a couple of her grandfather's paintings in our homes, and I walk by them and they have grown on me so much. They're like a part of my life, and I can just really appreciate his own work and talent. And so, without any further ado, we can dive into the section on art as spirituality, or as a spiritual path, excuse me. Um, he starts off right away. Waking up is the first act. So now we start waking up. One day something in you stirs and you wake up from ignorance and sheer unconsciousness. You wake up from the neglect of things that matter. So you start paying attention to the things that matter to you, right? I love later on the paragraph, some moments of awakening are minuscule. You hardly know they exist when they're happening, and only later do you realize that your world has changed. This is so true. This is unquestionably true. When I've made big changes in my life, all of a sudden it's kind of like something will happen and I'll react differently. I'm like, I didn't used to react like that if something like this happened, right? You wake up many times during your lifetime if you're lucky, and never stop waking as you make new significant discoveries. And I really believe when you're living a life that is about your spiritual awakening, I do believe that that is the case. On page 160, he just talks about, in the first paragraph, he talks about you have to discover the power of arts. So here's where he really starts digging into it. Later on in the section on that page, what is the deep purpose of art? Art allows you to play, express, represent, honor, heal, teach, sanctified, encode, and explore ideas in the Western culture, and explore ideas, right? Further on in the paragraph, it says you can learn from many different traditions how to bring art closer into the circle of your spirituality, which I absolutely love. And then he talks about Japan, India, Africa, all the different examples of different types of art that are beautiful, which is great. A couple of pages. Hold on just a second. Okay, so he goes on further down in the section Art as the House of Spirit. At the very bottom of the page, while the artwork had a substantial presence in itself, it also allowed a viewer in the proper spirit of devotion and knowledge to glimpse with a devotional eye through it. And then he spends some time talking about in the proper spirit of devotion and knowledge. And then he goes on to say, you have to abandon the modern way of seeing images as lifeless representations, right? Let's see. On the next page, or at the bottom of page 163, once you establish a serious connection with the world's spiritual traditions, you may feel a need for certain objects and rituals, which is awesome. And he goes on to talk about this idea of having little statues or pictures or things that remind you of these spiritual teachers. Many people I know have a picture of Jesus in their house. I know I've got a little Buddha on my altar that I have, and used to have pictures of Jesus all the time, used to wear a necklace with Jesus on it all the time. But he goes on to talk about it might be a photograph of nature or city or a human face. So whatever works for you. Again, just something as a reminder of this deep, deep connection. He starts talking about, goes back to Georgia O'Keeffe, who he mentioned before. I know some of you are familiar with her. Color is one of the great things in the world that makes life worth living to me. Just talking about colors. On page 165, he says, just as Georgia O'Keeffe relied on her worldly spirituality to bring out the eternal in the ordinary, you too can render the whole of your life and everything in it sacred. In everything you do, you can evoke the holiness of material, sensual life. And I love that. I love that, even the mundane, even the brushing your teeth, taking out the trash, the day-to-day stuff, that if you really want that to be, you can make it a very, very holy experience in everything it is that you do. Love that. On page 166, instead of distortion, I usually speak of deliteralization. I mean, the art piece pulls away the curtain of practicality and one-dimensional thinking that is so common in modern life. The distortion forces us to look deeper and not remain in the practical realm. It gives us a hardly perceptible shock and hardly noticeable pain, but enough to inspire a shift in vision. Again, what is it causing you to do? Look at things differently, right? And instead of just looking at things one-dimensionally, it pulls you in, which I love. Let's see. Excuse me. At the bottom of page 166, O'Keeffe's art is sacred because of the distance it takes us from our literal world. Isn't that what religion is about? Spiriting us out of the transcendent, twisting our minds out of our habitual pragmatism. But though she presents the sensation of depth, she doesn't obliterate the surface. Instead, she enhances them to the point of slight distortion, all that's necessary to get our imagination to work. Ultimately, it's the imagination that reveals the sacred within the ordinary. I love that statement. We've talked about imagination. Again, ultimately, it's the imagination that reveals the sacred within the ordinary. Let's see. Thought it was interesting on page 168. I've never heard of the Book of Kells, but I certainly want to look into it now. After she discussed those, I don't know. It'd be one of the things I was going to ask everybody in the group if they've ever heard of the Book of Kells. It sounds fascinating to me. On page 170, art and soul work. She goes on to say, or he goes on to say, excuse me, a piece of art is not something to look at as much as to see through, a portal or window rather than an object. It unveils a world already within you in hidden layers of your environment. In art, you see reality, but not ordinary reality. You see the sacred understood as the lifeblood and the heart of the world. You see myth hidden within the ordinary image, and you behold the eternal and timeless and the archetypal only a thin layer away from the everyday. Again, it's slowing down enough to appreciate it. Oh, let's see. On page 173, I highlighted the paragraph that starts off with, many people don't realize how central the imagination is to the religious and spiritual experiences. The object of faith and wonder is impossible to express in our usual logical and factual language. We need images that approximate our spiritual intuitions. I love that. The next section I thought is powerful. Religion is a devotion. And then it says devotion is one of those aspects of religion that seems to be both spiritual and psychological. And that whole section, he really starts to talk about this idea of devotion, which I love devotion. I love the idea of committing to doing something on a regular basis. That's where my morning ritual and practices come in, and I hope you have devotion in your life as well. Let's see. I have some things highlighted, but nothing really intense in that section, although I do like it. He talks about the religion of art, and then he talks about his joy of playing the piano. And in that section, he talks about the piano is my incense, my lighted candle, and my empty space. It takes me deep into meditation where I find sacred space. It takes me into deep meditation where I find the sacred just as I might uncover in the monastery choir stall. So for him, playing his piano is like him going into meditation. And I love that you get so lost into something that it can transcend everything that's going on around you as you go deeper and deeper and deeper into it, which is what meditation is and can be. I love it in the paragraph that starts off with art shows. The history of art has many examples, but perhaps none better than the paintings of simple everyday things, especially ordinary vases and bottles. I love it. Again, just pulling the divine out of the humane, the basic stuff there. He talks about a couple other things. Photography, he talks about, which I know some people are into photography. He talks about flower arranging, but there's so many things that you can find. So that's the section on art as a spiritual practice, as a spiritual path. And then we start off with the section called Muses and Angels, chapter 8. And he starts off chapter 8 with really a story about a man that he spent time with over in, I think it was Ireland or Scotland. And I'm not going to get into that story as much. It's a beautiful story. You know, the gentleman that he's talking about who taught him so much. But it's really where he found just some deep guidance. I think it's really interesting. He starts talking at the bottom of page 181 and 182. He talks about automatic writing, which I find is fascinating that he would actually bring that up. But where I did dive in a little bit more is where he talks on page 182. He talks about, is a muse real? Question mark. A muse is the experience of inspiration felt as subjective and having a human face. Many people speak of inspiration as coming from a voice, not necessarily an actual voice, but something like a voice. Some people think they hear an actual voice of inspiration in the room or outdoors. They hear words, and that's how some people get it. In the paragraph, the paragraph below, we usually think of a muse as being so subjective, an inner part of a person or mere metaphor, that we don't discuss the role of a muse in spiritual life. But I think the muse belongs in our discussion. After all, Christians have listened to angels and saints and the Virgin when they've appeared with messages. Mormonism is based on such revelations. In Islam, Gabriel reveals the Quran to Muhammad over 23 years. Gabriel interprets the dreams of Daniel in the Old Testament and has a role in the Sephira of the Kabbalah Yesod. The point is to be a good listener and keep your ears open for subtle sounds, utterances that are not spoken with the vocal cords, but they're to be heard anyways, or actual spoken, but the mean more than intended. So I'm going to just share with you some thoughts I have about this, because often what happens in the mornings when I get quiet, I'll get my inspiration. I receive what I call downloads, and downloads to me, it's so interesting because I've had other people confirm this and even call them downloads. And there may be some of you may relate to this, some of you may not. And by the way, we don't all get them the same way. But for me, what happens is I'll be sitting there and all of a sudden I'll hear a word or a thought will come through. And sometimes the thought, it's almost like what happens is as I focus in on that one word or the one thought, then what'll happen is it just goes, and all of a sudden, all of this information will come in at one time. And it's incredible because then I got to sit there for 15 or 20 minutes or 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour and write the whole thing out. But it's given to me in a flash of inspiration at one time. most of the time. There are those rare occasions where I'll get the information, I'll start writing it, and it just free flows. It's kind of like the automatic writing, if you will. So I completely relate to what he's talking about in here. In the section 184, he talks about how do you listen to a muse? In the last paragraph of the section. So the first and more general answer to the question about how to listen to a muse is to ease up your anxious modernism. In other words, slow down and listen. Listen for the voice of inspiration and heed it. And I love that. Because that's exactly what I've been able to do. And by the way, I don't do it perfectly all the time. It also says in the next section, a calm, alert mind. It says you have to be alert. That is true. You need an inner calm and an alert, not a busy mind. Maybe you need to be doing something habitual and not important, so your mind will be open for revelations. This is so true because I often have people come to me and say, well, I can't meditate. And I said, why don't you just go for a walk out in nature? And they'll look at me like I'm crazy. Like, you can do that? It's like, well, of course you can. It's the intention to go connect and get quiet. And you can be moving. You could brush your teeth and be meditating. So it's all about your intention. When creative thought first appears, it may not show itself in all its glory. This is so true. This is what I was saying earlier. Sometimes I'll get a little seed of it, and then it'll start to flare out as I spend time with that thought. And then it says it may be only a seed that will blossom later. It helps then if you can see the potential for a fresh idea or image. I love that he goes on to talk about the way different messages are received, and there's a section where he starts talking about the Shakers, which I didn't even realize there was such. I've heard of the Quakers. I don't think I ever heard of the Shakers, which is interesting. So he goes on to talk about the Shakers for a little bit on page 185, and then towards the bottom, as a part of your spiritual practice, you might learn how to be an instrument, a feather on the breath of God, as Hildegard of Bingen puts it. I love that. So the Shakers, while he continues on with their story, they felt like they should fast, rest, kneel, pray, and look into themselves, self-contemplation, self-reflection, those kinds of things. These are good suggestions. You need a clear space to see and hear something as delicate as the voice of a muse. I love it. Then now he starts bringing in this idea of angels. For some of you, angels are a big deal in your life. For me, I love angels. I play with them all the time. And so I have a deep, deep connection to all different kinds of angels. He talks about this idea of going into and seeing pictures of angels and spending time sitting in front of them at different art museums. And on page 188, he says, now sit down in front of one of these angels, and without being at all naive about it, learn from the image what qualities an angel has. I just also want to happen to mention a friend of mine, Michelle Bucart, has a beautiful online course about the angels and the 22 different angels and connecting with them. It's an incredible online course, and I highly recommend that if you get an opportunity. And if you have questions on where to find it, let me know. He goes on to say on page 189, their voices speak to us and give us direction and hints for our own creative work. Later on in the section, in the paragraph that starts with in Walden, Thoreau makes a slight reference to angels. And later on, he says, is turn a spiritual eye on ordinary nature, seeing the angels there. Thoreau knows that this is living in a sacred place. Yeah, angels, my experience is that they're there, but they need to be evoked and they need to be called forward. So if you think of an angel almost like a 12 power, then you're in the ballpark in terms of how to activate them and how to use them. Or I should say, more importantly, how to work with them, right? On page 190 at the top, don't look for yourself outside yourself. I love that. I love that. And then on page 191, he talks about his own rules for living with the muse. My shadow self are similar. Find some solitude without becoming a loner. Practice the art of waiting. Love it. trust the information provided, even if it isn't yet complete or clear. I love the idea of practice the art of waiting. I don't know if you remember when I was talking about my vision quest, how the spirit came to me and said, Mike, you're really, really good at doing, but you're horrible at being or waiting, right? Just sitting down and giving spirit an opportunity to connect with you. But when you're going 50,000 miles an hour, you don't have the opportunity to be able to do that. Okay. The rest of the section, I'm going to go over to this thing called daemon. Is an ancient Greek word for the inner presence or force that guides us by urging one direction or another, or by warning of dangers. So this to me is intuition. That's how I interpreted this section. Although it goes on to say it may appear in the form of a person or a place. He has again, I'm not sure the pronunciation, daemonic relationship to Ireland. And so he talks about that. I don't think I have, let's see, I think on page 198, I said you could make, he says, you could make or somehow obtain a statue that would represent the genius of your home and place it in your garden. So again, he talks about these different statues and stuff that you can place all over the place. And we've got a statue. Yeah, I already told you the ones on my altar, but I also have the statue of Buddha outside and some of the other ones, angels as well, right? I love the very end of this chapter. So I just think this is so powerful. As you amass the ingredients of your own religion, prepare yourself for a life requiring courage and focus. This is where the spiritual warrior and the spiritual jihad come into play. To maintain your religion, your religious convictions, you'll need every bit of courage you can summon up and every ally and resource that you can reach for. Religion is not just a nice thing to do. It's always a matter of life and death. That's somebody being committed to their own religion. And I love that. And I hope you enjoyed it too. So next week, we're going to be talking about, it's going to be chapter 9 and chapter 10. I hope you have a great rest of your day and enjoy the class. Talk to you soon.